Paul says he's recording it. Okay, thanks, Paul. All right, welcome everybody. Sorry about the delay. Just to repeat what I said before the recording, I'm going to share my screen and show the agenda doc, and Doug has volunteered graciously to take notes. Thanks in advance, Doug. All righty, let me close Slack. Okay, first thing, I just added this. I wanted to, per Paul's request, I wanted to start the discussion by talking about orphan mitigation. I understand, again, from Paul that you guys have made some progress last week on orphan mitigation, and I wanted to try, at least attempt, to finalize our plan for designing some solution for orphan mitigation, and then to start implementing it in a prototyping PR. Sorry, I can't talk today. So if someone would, could they fill in kind of the progress we've made so far in a brief summary? Doug, perhaps?
Honestly, I was going to ask the question. I have no idea what our current status is.
Okay. Neither do I. Obviously, I've missed the last two design meetings.
Well, we didn't. I don't recall us discussing those in any design meetings. I think any decisions that were made may have been done through issues or PRs, but I don't know for sure, to be honest.
Okay, so the only one that I know of is Paul has added, he put in, I think now, a finished and ready to review PR for terminal conditions. That's kind of a foundation for orphan mitigation. So what I'm going to do is basically just leave it at that for now. This, again, was Paul's request, so I'll ask him to go either write something up for this or bring it up for next week's meeting. We also have design meetings, I think, tomorrow through Friday, except for Thursday maybe, so that'll give us plenty of time to go into it there as well. All right, Doug, we're going to move on to you. Looks like you have review agreed to, but on hold decisions. The first one looks like something about splitting the plan from service class, so I will let you take it away.
Yeah, a quick point of order, I guess. Are there any other non-design issue topics that we wanted to discuss, or is that it for the regular status call? Okay, not hearing any topics. Okay, moving on. So I just wanted to quickly sort of rebase on where our decisions were from last week. First one, splitting the plan out from service class. I can't remember which day it was. It may have been Wednesday. I think we agreed to split it out, but we wanted to give people a couple of days to make sure they're okay with that direction. And it sounds like no one's complained, so we're going to head that path or down that path. So people, so we just need someone to, I guess, volunteer to actually write up the PR that's going to be used as a prototype for splitting it out. I guess we could start with the proposal that's in the issue, but that's the first one. The second one was the pod preset. Now, Paul.
So let me. Sorry, Doug. Let me. I want to go back to splitting plan out. So we now have all come to a decision that we're going to write up the proposal. We're going to continue discussion on this in a GitHub PR. Is that accurate?
Yep.
Okay, I'll write that down, Doug, while you keep talking.
Okay, thanks. Remove pod preset from binding. I didn't hear. Well, we agreed last week that our tentative agreement was going to be to remove pod preset from binding, but we haven't agreed yet on what was going to happen after that. But we did want to give people a couple of days to think about whether splitting it out was the right thing to do. And again, we haven't heard any complaints about that, so that's our current plan of action. However, Paul has asked for us to hold off really discussing pod presets until he can make the call. I think mainly because he wants to advocate his pod preset binding resource, as well as make a case for requiring that to go in at the same time, or at least possibly before the removal of pod preset, even though some of us think it's a tangential issue, he wants to wait. So rather than forcing that decision without him here, we should probably wait until he can make the call. So that's that one. But the net of that one for the notes is, it looks like everybody's agreed to remove pod preset from binding, and we just need to figure out the next steps. And we already have a PR to do that. So we're just on hold. Finally, rename of our classes. Let's see, if I remember correctly, I believe last week we agreed that we do want to do a rename. The general consensus was that we should use a common prefix for all of our classes. I believe we decided to try to resolve that on Slack or resolve what the prefix was on Slack. And we were bouncing between service versus service catalog. And I believe we landed more on service catalog, even though it was a bit longer. That's where we kind of landed as a starting point. With the understanding that when we go to do a broader API review with the rest of the Kubernetes community, they may push back and want to change, but at least we have, a decision going forward for right now. One aspect that was merged into that issue at Paul's request, rather than keeping a separate issue, was I brought up an issue of renaming binding to something else, potentially just service key, or as Nail was promoting or suggesting, something like instance access key to be a little bit more descriptive. So that's one thing that we may want to bring up or discuss now to see whether people have a preference or whether people disagree with renaming it for some history. The reason I'm suggesting that we rename binding to something else is because if we remove pod preset from binding, a binding no longer does a binding. It's just there to obtain credentials. In other words, some kind of key or secret or something. We're going to have other resources, whether it's just pod presets or pod preset binding or something else, that's actually going to do the action of, quote, binding. So we might as well, save that word for the proper resource and not try to overload binding.
So it's also worth mentioning that binding is a core Kubernetes resource that in 1.7 defaults to not accessible if you have RBAC turned on, not readable. So you'll be forced to kubectl get binding.servicecatalog.k8s.io versus just kubectl get instance, for example. So we may want to consider not using binding at all if we're talking about renaming things now.
Well, yeah, and that was actually brought up last week when we talked about this issue, because that was actually the main driver for this. I think it was the overlap with the core binding thing. Okay. But just to be clear, even if we did keep binding around, it would probably be service catalog binding anyway, because of the common prefix decision.
Cool.
Right.
So where we're at now is are we going, Doug, would you like to talk now about what to rename everything to? So what prefix to use first of all, and then whether to rename bindings? Or are you thinking,
if we can get through that quickly, if we can get through that quickly, I'd like to. Hopefully the prefix should be easy because we tried to resolve that last week. And so let me try to go really quick through it and say, are there any objections to going with service catalog as the prefix for now?
Doug, I'd just like to say I like going with service catalog, but an important point that was brought up in the meeting and in the Slack channel is that it would be good for us to use that to try to drive some consensus or something new in the Kubernetes community itself, that there is this problem of namespacing API resources that aren't in the core, and it would be good to get that addressed.
Do we have a volunteer to open up that issue in core?
Sorry, Brendan, you mind repeating that?
Yeah, so as more Kubernetes incubators come online with their own resources, right, there's going to be this namespacing issue in kubectl for resource names. And so I think maybe Morgan brought this up. Let's make our resource names as obnoxious as possible so that it can drive discussion in the API review about how people are going to be able to name their resources and have them be namespaced or scoped somehow.
Okay, yes, I agree. I would ask that whoever opens that issue in core, as you would guess, I was going to say, talk about binding specifically, but also acknowledge in that issue that it is possible to reference the fully qualified name of anything that any aggregated API server adds. I believe that will probably help frame the discussion a lot better.
Right. So do we have a volunteer to open up that issue in core?
Yeah, and actually I'll volunteer to do that.
Okay.
Yeah, Paul said we need to set up a meeting with someone, so I didn't know who to do that with, so yeah, fine. If it's an issue, that's an issue, that's fine.
Okay. So going back to the high order bit here for us, are there any objections to service catalog as our prefix? All right. Now to the binding resource itself, um, is there any objection to renaming it to something else other than binding? Or I guess I should rename it to something else other than service binding, since binding is misleading.
I guess my main question is how okay are we with breaking from the open service broker naming convention? That this is not. Yes, it is doing binding things in the general sense, and our specific implementation of binding is not necessarily binding to something or binding from something, but it still is a wrapper around the open service broker concept and function call that is called a binding. And I would worry that we as a platform change the name and other platforms all operate as bindings, and there's some conceptual or naming mismatch there.
Right. So I think normally I would have the same kind of concern, but Cloud Foundry itself already set a precedent for this. They allow you to create bindings as well as they allow you to create service keys. And I think in our current use of this particular resource, we are actually creating service keys. And so I think there is precedent for doing this, and it doesn't seem to cause any confusion in the Cloud Foundry world.
And so just to clarify that, a service key in their platform is basically just credential storage. Is that fair to say?
Yep, basically.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Then I think I'm okay. I would almost say then let's call it service key and keep to as close to their concepts as possible.
Okay, so let's the first question first. Is there any objection then to renaming binding to something else?
Well, I guess I will also. I'm still confused. I'm sitting here with Brendan, but I'm still confused and don't understand how service key in any way is the same intent as when you say I want to create a binding and you create the resource, and as a side effect of that, it calls the open source broker API, which is create binding. Like, why would service key be sufficient? It seems like the credential store that Pivotal has introduced is a different thing. It's just a different mechanism for propagating credentials to somebody that's using them in a more secure way or in a different way. It's not the same intent as a binding. So does it make sense? Because I don't understand how you could change it to service key when with the intent that you're doing is to bind these things together, and maybe one implementation detail is that there are service keys created that it's created in vault or in a secret or whatever, but that's kind of an implementation detail that shouldn't be exposed in my mind.
Right. So one thing to keep in mind is that with the previous decision of removing pod preset from binding, that linking that you're talking about is not happening anymore. The action today of creating a binding, if we accept the PR that Nail has opened up to remove pod preset, it does nothing but creates the secret and get the credentials from the broker. That's it. There's no binding action whatsoever. If we get to the point where we define an additional resource, like what Paul is suggesting, called pod preset binding, then it's accurately named, because it is actually going to create a binding, and under the covers, hopefully it will call the appropriate broker operation. Does that help, Martin?
No, but I mean, you just said that I create a binding and it's still going to call the broker and get the stuff from the broker. Whether
but the
it
fact
actually plumbs it through into pod preset or not is an implementation detail that if you choose to just not do that last step, but you choose to squirrel the things away in some other store or just leave them in a secret, I don't understand how that how that changes the intent of I'm creating a binding which triggers calling the service broker. The service broker returns coordinates and credentials, and then what you do with them is, I mean, that's sausage making. I don't really care. I mean, my intent was still that I am creating a binding. Like, I don't know why you're defining binding as just being connecting the last mile and I mean, I'm assuming you meaning shoving that into environment variables or something.
Well, okay, let me phrase it differently. From a Kubernetes user's perspective, when they create what is today called a binding, they are not actually binding anything. Do you agree with that?
Well, I mean, you got to define what you mean by binding. I don't know what I'm agreeing or disagreeing with.
Okay, so
I disagree with that because we have in the past, it sounds like in the past 3 or so business days, we've now redefined binding from something that Kubernetes does in conjunction with the OSB API to something purely Kubernetes.
Well, no.
Based on the previous definition that we've had up until then, by submitting a binding, we are doing a binding, regardless of how the credentials, coordinates, etc., get surfaced in the pods. We still are creating a binding.
Okay, maybe I'm mixing things up here. Okay, let's assume we're in a world where Nails PR gets merged, and our current resource called binding no longer has pod preset inside there. Okay. In that world, the only thing that the binding resource does is it goes to the broker and gets the credentials, and then it stores it inside a secret and then stops. It does nothing else. Any notion of binding from a Kubernetes user's perspective does not happen. Does everybody understand that?
Okay, so I don't have the context of why the pod preset is being removed, but I don't really care.
Okay.
What I'm wondering about is, are you saying, I mean, you also mentioned something that you were calling a pod preset binding.
Mm-hmm.
Are you expecting, so if that's somehow restoring binding to the way it has been or is right now, and giving it another name with the word pod preset attached, and that'll have the same functionality as what we have today before this PR gets merged. Is that a fair characterization? Am I understanding what you mean here?
I think the way you described it is at least headed in the direction that Paul is expecting. Yes. The reason
so are you expecting a Kubernetes user then, if they want to bind to a service instance from a service broker, that they will no longer ever create a binding, but they will create a pod preset binding instead?
That's unclear to me because we haven't discussed pod's preset binding resource, right? And what's not clear to me is whether they have to manually create today's binding and then create a pod preset binding on top of that, or whether they just create a pod preset binding and under the covers, it creates today's binding.
I think it'd be a useful exercise here to go back to the days before pod preset existed, when we decided on this name. So we decided on the name binding originally because it matched up with the OSB, but we also discussed at length, both in person and I believe on an issue, that this represents the binding of a pod or pods to the credentials that get written to a secret.
Correct.
Once pod presets came on the scene, up through now, we still considered this a binding operation. Now it sounds like pod presets have changed the thinking from OSB centric to Kubernetes pod preset centric.
Well, there are use cases where we don't need pod presets at all, and that's what Doug mostly is talking about. That like now at this level of binding, we just say that like binding is a representation, like client-side representation of OSB object, and yes, it is called binding, and that's why we probably like called it binding. But in Kubernetes world, there is one more step, and it could be pod preset, it could be passing these credentials somewhere else, it could be deployment, whatever. And this last step is not part of the binding resource. It's a thing on top of binding.
Yep, I'm with you. That's how I view it. I mean, I just view it as the binding is a thing. We can call it something else, but that's the thing that triggers the OSB call and writes the credentials and coordinates back to the thing, probably a secret. And I'm assuming that there's going to be something on top, as you say, Neil. But I don't for that reason, actually. I don't see the reason that we are going to change the name binding.
Because it doesn't accurately represent what it is from a Kubernetes user's point of view. Now, I agree.
Well, that's the thing. So what has changed? So why did we believe it accurately represented it before pod preset binding became an idea?
Right, and this
Why
is
don't we now.
right. This is the critical piece. And up until just 3 days ago, the assumption has always been when you define a binding, when a Kubernetes user defines a binding, they are creating an object to link the credentials for the service with their application, right? Whether it was going to be through pod preset or something else, that binding resource was going to be the thing that would bring those two things together, right? By removing pod preset from binding, and at the same time conceptually agreeing that we are no longer going to reference, quote, the application from the binding, whether it's through pod preset or label selector or anything else, we have effectively said we are no longer doing a binding with this resource anymore.
Well,
That's the difference.
There is where I disagree, because there are use cases where a binding is enough because a binding writes a secret out. So for example, I have a use case where if you install a Helm chart with a binding in it and a deployment in it, you are able to submit the binding with a secret name and submit the deployment that references the same secret name. And that's how effectively you bind your application to the service that you've just bound, probably provisioned to.
I agree. But think of it from an end user's point of view, right? They're not binding when they ask for the credentials and to have those credentials put into a secret. What they're doing is technically asking for the service key.
I think if I'm understanding Doug correctly, I think what he's trying to say is that binding is the consumption of the credentials. It's not the creation of the credentials.
Exactly. Now it's a little bit confusing because Cloud Foundry, the Open Service Broker API does mix those two under the word binding, and it's an unfortunate artifact of their history. But from a Kubernetes user perspective, who I think is, let me put it this way, I think making things make sense from a Kubernetes user's perspective is more important than adhering to a particular word that the Service Broker API uses, because a Kubernetes user will never really care about the Open Source Broker API.
Okay. All right. I can see that. And I can actually get on board with that. What I would say, though, is it sounds like we don't all have agreement. So, Doug, would you be able to take an action item to write this up in an issue? And then we can continue it tomorrow, probably tomorrow. And if not tomorrow, then the next one, which I think is Thursday.
Yeah, that's fine. It's just funny because I originally did open a separate issue and Paul asked me to merge it into this one. So, okay.
Okay. Let's put it on the top of the list for tomorrow then, and we can have a night to think about it. Hopefully we can come to a decision tomorrow, if not Thursday.
Yeah. So just to be clear then, is everybody is okay with the prefix of service catalog, and the only open question now is just whether we rename binding to be key or something else, right?
That's what I've recorded here.
Okay, is there any objection to that? Okay, cool.
The only thing I would have to say is that key might not be the right name to rename to.
That's fine. Just all I ask is for suggestions for alternatives.
Yeah, as long as that particular point is up for discussion still, then I'm fine with this.
Yeah, to be honest, key would not have been my first choice, other than that's what Cloud Foundry used. So I was going for a little bit of consistency between those two platforms. But if you can think of something better, I'm up for it.
All right. So I've recorded the action item, Doug, and I've recorded the open question for us about renaming. It looks like we've exhausted the renaming our classes section. So I think, Neil, you're up next. Support for alternative auth proposals.
Yeah, there were I think two main issues currently raised for supporting alternative auth protocols. One was raised by Aaron, I believe, for JWT token support, and the other is for supporting alternative auth algorithms protocols in general. And I believe there was something about Google JWT token again. And my suggestion is to probably talk about how do we add auth protocol support in general, whether we have to implement all the authentication modes inside service catalog, or there are two alternative things I mentioned there. That one is to extend the service catalog at the startup just by passing the plugin interface implementation in the main method, basically. So you have to build your own application, which will invoke, imports the service catalog code base and then passes the alternative auth implementation. And the other, we just need to decide whether we can hook. And this is one point. And another point is that I think it was suggested by Jordan Legit, I don't know how to pronounce it correctly. So he proposed to keep it completely separate from service catalog. So service catalog can support, apart from basic auth, for example, could just support opaque token, which will be generating authorization header with bearer and then anything stored in secret, whatever is stored there and however it is produced there. And then there could be a completely separate running process which is responsible for maintaining this token stored in secret. And for example, rotate this token. If the token is short-lived, 10 minutes or so, it could continuously run and every 5 minutes refresh the token or anything like that. And then service catalog will just consume the token without really understanding what's the algorithm of generating it. And I think actually these two approaches are not exclusive. And one could be just an option for bearer token, and the plugins could be still required if there is some really weird authentication mechanism needed for a particular vendor, which maybe doesn't involve authorization header at all, or doesn't use neither basic auth, neither token, or have something else, maybe have some extra headers and something else. So we could probably discuss this. But yeah, I agree with Jimmy that opaque token as a first step could probably be good enough for now, and plugin support could be left for the future discussion once we actually have this kind of use case where having opaque token is not enough.
I will say I agree with Jimmy as well. That's the first comment.
Okay, so are there any objections against having opaque token support in service catalog and requiring basically the vendor or users who needs to implement the who need support for Google specific authentication or anything else? We have our own actually JWT based, but the generation of token or acquiring the token is out of scope of JWT. So there must be some specific separate application implementing particular algorithm of acquiring the token and putting it into the secret. Are there any objections against it?
Hey,
would it? Sorry, Aaron, you have raised this JWT tokens issue. Would it be good enough for you?
Yeah, I think both you and Jimmy said, as a first implementation of this, that would be good enough. My overall goal for raising that issue was to add something better than basic auth, and this would achieve that as a first implementation. And then I also think that this would help us decide what, if anything, to build next. So that would mean, what is the shape of a custom auth plugin, for example?
Okay, cool. I can actually start working on the PR then for that, to just like to have something more concrete to discuss.
So
Awesome.
let me back
Now,
up.
I was just gonna ask that because I found the more general issue. I in general, I think it sounds like a good idea, but it would be good to see a concrete proposal so that I could give that to our security guys here and make sure that they see it as meeting our requirements around being able to do auth.
Okay.
Okay,
I have actually seen
I
some
wanted
other.
to back up real quick. So did we get an answer? Does anyone disagree with starting with this as a proposal, a proposed implementation?
Yeah, mine was a partial disagreement. Just that I would like to see something more concrete than that one comment, just to be able to float by people.
Okay. Does anyone agree with this in principle? Okay. So I guess it sounds like the next thing, Neil, is to write a proposal for this in the service catalog repo.
Mhm. Yeah, there is already open PR, but I can't remember who was it, but someone from Google, I believe, who just created a PR with abstracting the authentication from basic auth, basically by creating an interface with like two methods, add headers to the request and parse secret, I believe, something like that. And
Yeah, there
this could be a
is.
prerequisite for this feature, I guess.
Yeah, there is a good amount of machinery already available. Even in our data types, we have a way to generically reference secrets based on the type of auth the user wants.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what would be good is to have a proposal that describes how we're going to utilize that machinery in order to create that header and then send that header.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sounds good.
And also what that separate process needs to look like, the thing that's managing the secret. I think it's going to be very important.
Well, for a service catalog, it would be out of scope, right? It just means that there must be some, like basically secret resource controller, which will be doing whatever it needs to. And I think it should actually watch for all broker objects probably, and like check what was the type of authentication, and if the type of authentication is equal to the one which you are responsible for, you have to basically, based on the, I don't know, broker name or something like that, go fetch the credentials, generate the token, or just fetch the token and put it into the secret, and then run this process continuously to refresh the tokens to because they expire, right? So like I can provide some example, but like for my own use case, for example, it will be for sure something internal service specific, because like we have our own key storage and stuff like that. I'm not sure whether there is a simple solution. So I mean, like we can just emulate by saying like, hey, this is a hello world application which just generate random token and puts it into the secret. Will it be good enough for the demo?
So for purposes of a proposal, Neil, I think writing down in English, just not in a language or as a prototype, okay. Just saying this is what an out of process system might do to update the JWT token. This is why it exists, and obviously mentioning that process will be out of scope of the first implementation. Okay. I think that would be good enough.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was looking for. Thank you, Aaron.
Okay, makes sense.
Okay, Neil, did you have anything else for this one?
No.
Okay. All right, Doug, you are up using secrets in Service Catalog. Go for it.
Yes. So I apologize. For previous design sessions, I was able to sort of go through the list of open issues and at least put together a proposal for us to discuss. And unfortunately, we're at the stage now where we've exhausted that list of things that I've actually had a chance to write a concrete proposal for. So we're starting to get into the ones where we're just going to be sort of designing on the fly or talking on the fly. So I apologize for that. And this first one is sort of a carryover from the very first design session we did last week. which is now that we've got resolution from SIG auth that we're allowed to use secrets for our use cases, there's an open question of how do we handle secrets that are being updated outside of a service catalog process, so we don't know about it and stuff like that. And I believe the open question here is something along the lines of, when a secret does get updated by a user, do we detect it and act upon it, or do we wait for the user to do an explicit action? So Nail, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one of the primary use cases we have to discuss is once we allow secrets to be used for parameters, if someone was to update one of those secrets, do we automatically detect the secret is updated, or do we wait for them to like take some action on the Open Service Broker API side of things? I'm sorry, on the service catalog side of things, to force us to re-get the secret. Is that correct? That's sort of the question.
Yeah, I think this is correct question, but I think that even last week we have already mentioned that the best thing we can do for now is probably, because as you just mentioned that bulk watch secrets are not supported yet, is to just, for now we can just treat secrets as immutable. However, they are obviously not. And for the user, it means that if he wants to force the new secrets to be propagated, he would be required to rename the secret or something like that, to basically update the binding or or other resource which is responsible for injecting a secret, something like that, I guess. And once we have bulk watch support, we can actually like properly support the mutable secrets.
Okay, so it sounds like the more abstract decision then is the user will have to take some explicit action to force us to re-examine the secret if it is changed. We just need to agree on the exact mechanism, whether it's the rename you described or something else. That's a decision point for us. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Agree.
Does everybody agree with that, or let me turn it around? Is there any objection to heading down that path?
So just to clarify, the path now, correct me if I'm wrong, the path now is to effectively treat secrets as immutable with plans to allow users to poke service catalog to indicate that a secret has been updated.
Yes. Yes.
I do not object to that.
Okay. So then,
Does anybody else?
yeah. Okay. Not hearing anything. The next question then is the rename that Neil proposed the proper poke that Aaron said? Or is there a different mechanism people would like us to consider?
What is the rename again? I may have missed that.
So binding has a secret name field, and like the easiest way to support the like immutable secrets which can actually be updated is to just change the secret name field in binding, so that binding controller will react to this update and will have to generate a new secret, potentially with a new content, something like that.
Now, to be clear, when you talk about the secret name, you're not talking about the secret name that we use to store the credentials from the broker. You're talking about the secret name for parameters. Is that correct?
Ah, yeah, sorry, I got confused. Same thing.
Well, it's slightly different.
Instant, I mean, like instance has a secret, a reference to the secret, right? So once you update the secret, you just say like, hey, this is a new secret you need to pass to OSB. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, well, the reason I point out is because secret for the credentials is very different, because one, it can be defaulted, which means the user could specify blank, right? So then we'll pick the instance name or something like that, or the binding name for the secret name. So that's why I wanted to make sure we're talking about the parameter secrets.
Yeah, sorry, I got confused.
Okay.
So I have a possibly dumb question. For broker credentials, do we cache those at all?
Well, there is a secret storing the credentials. That's it.
Yes.
If we fail to create a secret, what we currently do is just to replay the entire binding. So we will have to invoke the request to OSB again and fetch the credentials again. And that's actually, there is a separate issue in OSB. I have raised that, like, according to the spec, if like broker is required to return the same credentials if the request contains the same parameters. And I don't believe that stateful broker can do that.
Right. So backing up though, we have there, one of the use cases for secrets is to store the broker credentials. That's one of the three, I believe.
Yeah,
I don't think that we cache those. So if that secret has ever changed, we don't need to, no one needs to poke service catalog, because on every broker request, again, if I'm right about the caching,
yeah.
on every broker request, we'll reread the secret.
Yes, correct.
And,
well, only if the user, like, could be malicious user, will manually update the secret, which was previously generated by broker, then we won't react on it. And
well,
that's
no,
probably a proper behavior.
The broker, the secret that holds broker credentials will not be updated, will never be written by service catalog. It's always just read. And I believe that it's read every time. So we've solved, we don't need to poke for that use case of secrets. And if I remember implementation right as well, for parameters, instance parameters secrets, we also don't cache. So if the secret is changed, that would be the instance where, Neil, we probably would need to use your method of poking.
Yeah. Well, the only problem with, like, passing updated parameters is that service catalog will only watch on instance, not on secret, which means that whenever secret is updated, there is no reaction to it. So you have to do something in instance so that service catalog will take an action and pass the updated secrets.
So I am okay with that, with the understanding that it may be a temporary fix for the secret watching issue.
Yeah, in Kubernetes 1.8, I think SIG guys said that they expect to add some kind of support for bulk watch secrets, and then we can add a separate resource controller watching on secrets we care about, and then that, like, this use case would be automated, not just asking user to do something manually.
Sure.
So,
okay,
Aaron, you said something about, I just want to correct one thing. You said we don't need a poking mechanism for the broker credentials, right?
Right. I believe so. I have to double check the code.
I think we do, in the sense that if they do change the credentials, if they want us to requery the broker for some reason, we have to have some poking mechanism. Now, we will have that poking mechanism at some point automatically, no matter what, right? We're gonna, because Paul suggested we have a cron-based reget catalog and a manual force of reget catalog, so it will happen automatically. But that becomes, in my mind, the poking mechanism, right?
Yeah, I would agree.
Doug, are you suggesting that when I change the credentials to a broker, it may change the catalog that's returned? Is that your concern?
If not, no, I'm not concerned about it at all. I just want to make sure that when Aaron said that we will not have a poking mechanism, we implicitly do, or not. We in a roundabout way do, because we're going to allow people to say, for this broker, go re-get the catalog, and that can be the poking mechanism if someone needed a poking mechanism.
Yeah, I think that Aaron has actually, like, he meant that is just that this poking mechanism is not triggered by secret update.
Right.
Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Just
Okay.
because it's just by virtue of the fact that it's a read instead of a post put whatever else, something that's possible mutative, then we have an easier poking mechanism that can, I think, be done outside of the scope of this decision.
Yeah, I agree.
So Jimmy asked an interesting question in the chat, which is, can we basically fake this thing out by doing our own watcher until the real stuff is ready?
So
what would this fake thing do?
from the chat, he said, can we just, quote, pretend there's a bulk watch for secrets and just spawn a Go routine per secret? And then one day when we can replace it with the real API when it's available.
I'm not sure, like, if it really helps. I mean, if there is zero functionality, why would we tie ourselves to particular like implementation?
So that would solve the issue, yes, and it would allow us to proceed without the poking mechanism. But I would recommend we don't do that until SIG auth has a, quote, blessed way to watch essentially what we call bulk watch secrets. And the reason for that is because I would like to make it very explicit for a user to do a mutative call to the OSB broker when something changes in the secrets.
Yeah, I think it's good enough, and probably, I mean, like, with the problem with like a background Go routine is that you have to like set up the period or something and just say like, okay, you updated the secret and we will react in 30 minutes from this or something like that. And I don't think this is a good user experience. And like, if the user actually needs the secret to be propagated, it's probably faster and easier to just rename the secret, and that's it.
Aaron, can I just clarify something you said? It sounded like earlier you said you weren't a fan of having the secret rename as a permanent solution, but what you just said now made it seem like you wanted something that was more explicit than just changing something in the secret itself. Like you want there to be an explicit operation almost that allows the user to say, yes, do the update now.
Yeah, so just to clarify that, right now, because there's not a what I call blessed way to do watching of many secrets from SIG auth, I would like it to be very explicit when something happens, specifically when something happens on the broker that will cause a mutation. So for example, I don't want someone to update instance parameters in a secret and then have that automatically go and reprovision, for example. However, if in the future SIG auth has a, again, blessed way to bulk watch secrets, then we can document the fact that we bulk watch secrets in the right way. And that may cause, if you change an instance parameter, a secret for instance parameters, that may cause a reprovision.
Okay, great. Because in my mind, I'm okay with the renaming the secret right now, but it doesn't seem like a good user experience as a long-term thing. So I just wanted to make sure that I'm not the only one who thinks that.
Oh yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, it's
great.
not a good one, but I think it's necessary right now to just have that pane.
So to be clear, I think what I'm hearing is the user has to poke the system in some way, and they have to change, picking on instance for a sec, they have to change the instance spec in some way, and we can recommend one good way to do it is to rename the secret. But technically, they could do anything they wanted as long as they do some sort of update to the instance spec, because that would cause the exact same effect, right?
Yes.
Okay.
They could even, like, I don't know, if they could even create a new instance, for example, if they want to.
Yeah, that's a bit heavy, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. It could be an option.
Yeah. But my bigger concern here is, because I agree with what Brendan was saying, it's not a great user experience, but my bigger fear would be that we introduce something that we now have to support, in essence, for a very long time when the bulk watch does come around, and I don't want to have to remove something or deprecate and stuff like that. So I'm okay with recommending a rename for the secret for right now or something else, as long as we don't introduce something new.
Yeah, I agree. And also, like, if we make some hacky decision that probably Jimmy has suggested, if it will be good enough from the user experience, I'm afraid that it would stop us from implementing proper way blessed by SIG auth. And if we have this like painful way, it's much easier to justify the implementation of the proper way of supporting secret controllers. than just running a Go routine in the background.
So I would ask everyone to look at the 2 decisions that I've written down here. Tell me if these are written in an unclear way to you. Tell me if you have any other objections to this before we move on.
I'd like to do a slight rewording to the first one, because it's not so much that secrets are immutable as much as doing a rename on the secret is our recommended approach for getting this poke.
Gotcha. Okay.
Well, but also you're in Kubernetes you can update secrets, but we will not be looking for those, right? So something about the fact that even if you update secrets, that won't be reflected by our system.
Yeah, because people might look at that statement, if we put it in our documentation in place, and say, wait a minute, what are you guys talking about? Of course secrets are mutable.
Sure. Okay, so we're not going to watch for updates on secrets referenced by our resources. And if you want to update the secret, then you have to update the resource itself somehow.
Yeah, and we can give recommendation for secret rename as a viable option for now.
Okay. All right. Anything else anyone wants to throw in about secrets before we move on?
I don't think we have time for another issue.
Okay, yeah, with that, I think with 4 minutes, we probably can't go into deprovision requests to an instance. So we will get 4 minutes back, and I believe we have a design meeting tomorrow at the same time, I think, but don't quote me on that. So I hope to see everyone there tomorrow.
Yeah, it looks like Paul scheduled them tomorrow through Thursday at the same time.
Yeah,
Awesome.
just a request for people. Please go through the list of either the issues that I've put into the agenda doc for the last 3 times to see whether that's the complete list or not. If you see other ones, go to add it to the agenda. But more importantly, try to pick one of the ones that we haven't talked about yet and see if there's a concrete proposal that we can all throw arrows at the next phone call, rather than just randomly picking one and trying to come up with a concrete proposal on the fly. Having one in advance makes things go much faster.
Great.
And you don't want me coming with all concrete proposals. That's not pretty.
Make Doug do all the work. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, I don't mind that. It's just I know they're not going to be pretty.
Yeah. Well, neither will mine.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Hope to see all of you tomorrow.
See you.
Okay. Bye.